Welcome in, everyone, to a new edition of Just Another College Football Podcast, what I am calling the grand reopening of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. If you have not come across this podcast, first of all, thank you very much for tuning in. It means the world to me. We have now set up the YouTube page, so please subscribe over there, like over there, then go over to Spotify, do the exact same thing, then on over to Apple Podcasts and do the exact same thing, because this is something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I did get into it during the 2023 season, stepped away last February, about a year ago today, really about a year ago, and started at GSMC, which was an incredible experience for me. Golden State Media Concepts gave me a great chance to talk about college football every day. If you're coming over from that page, glad to have you here. Obviously, awesome to have people watching along. Obviously, was an incredible thing. Did a daily show Monday through Friday over there, but now kind of found my way back to this passion project of mine, something that I've wanted to do for a very long time, hoping to build this out over the next couple of months, next couple of years, and really create this into something special. But I'm Tommy Brzee. Just a brief kind of story about me. I grew up in the Atlanta area. If you're new to this show, grew up in the Atlanta area, big time Atlanta sports fan. Grew up actually a Georgia Tech fan during kind of the Paul Johnson era, triple option era of college football. So absolutely love those teams. Joshua Nesbitt, Justin Thomas. Those are some of my favorite players growing up. Also grew up a Texas fan. So both my parents went to UT Austin. Huge Texas fan. Obviously a massive Longhorn fan because you kind of got to be. If both your parents went to Texas, you were going to be a big time Texas fan one way or the other. And then finally went to college at Georgia. So am a Georgia Bulldog by heart. Was a very complicated season in 2024, having both those fandoms kind of battling against each other. And mainly, I kind of just wanted to go through all of that to start this show because I think it's an important thing to talk about. I think of way too many people in this business, both in sports and in college football more specifically, try to hide a lot of their biases, try to hide kind of their fandoms and different things. And I don't really see the utility in that. I don't see the point in that. I don't think any of us benefit from you not really knowing where I'm coming from, you not really knowing my story and my past, and really kind of my fandoms going into this thing. Now, I try my best to be impartial. I promise that. I try my best to give it to everyone the same exact way and not necessarily be biased towards one team, but all of us have our biases, and hiding them just doesn't really do anyone any good. So wanted to make sure I got that out of the way. Really, really happy for everyone that is watching along. Cannot thank you guys enough, and continue to watch along. This will likely be once a week during the off season. Probably kicking it a little into high gear during the season, maybe 2 a week, maybe 3 a week. Still kind of deciding on that. But I'm also putting out blogs and putting out a number of different things on my own website. So if you want to go follow over there, excuse me, let me pull this up real quick. Over on X, if you want to follow me, it's Brzee_Thomas. If you want to go over to Instagram, got two for the for the Just Another College Football Podcast. CFB Podcast is one, as well as Brzee.Thomas. We'll be posting there, both of those pretty regularly throughout this offseason and into the season, obviously. And then my blog, Thomas Brzee, BRESEE.squarespace.com, posting a ton of blogs, especially around the combine that's coming up, and is actually something we'll get into here in a second. And overall, just wanted to, talk about college football. That's kind of where I'm coming from here. I'm a fan like all of you guys. I'm not going to act like I am some great expert. I did not play the sport at a very high level, did not play in college, did not really play in high school. So I'm not going to try to talk down to anyone or anything like that. This is a podcast made by a fan for fans. So would love for you guys to follow along any type of college football fan you are. If you're just getting into it, great. Love to have you here. If you're just, if you're not too into it yet, but you're trying to get into it, please come along. If you're a huge diehard fan, you're right here with me. So absolutely, you're more than welcome to follow on. And overall, really just kind of want this to be comfortable. Not going to be a scripted podcast. Now, I do have some notes. I'm not just going to come on here and ramble every week, but there will be a kind of a good nature to this, a kind of ad-lib nature to this, so it feels a little bit more accessible. I don't necessarily love all the scripted stuff that goes out every now and then, so decided to kind of go away from that a little bit. Going to be a relatively unscripted podcast, and we'll kind of work from there. Would love to get the fans involved at some point. If you guys have any questions or things you want me to cover, please drop them in the comments or drop them pretty much anywhere. Tweet at me on Twitter, any of those places. I'm more than happy to answer, and we'll definitely get to that throughout this next little bit. But that's about enough about me. We are back on this Just Another College Football podcast. That's enough about the backstory of myself, the backstory of this podcast, and where I've been for the past year. But now I'm back, and let's go ahead and jump into this. And we got a big thing happening in the world of college football right about now, and it has to do with two of the biggest conferences in college football, the Big Ten and the SEC, and the CFP mainly. There's a big time things happening around the CFP in terms of what's going to happen in 2026. What is going to be the next kind of iteration of the playoff? We had the 12 team this year, and it went off really relatively well. You know, there were some downsides. Obviously, the seeding made a lot of people very angry, and that was a huge topic of conversation. And there were some kinks. There's no doubt about that, and they're trying to work those out. And there's a couple of different conversations about changing the seeding going into 2025, changing the seeding so it's not just the top four conference champions. It's just the top four teams in the country, which I think a lot of people are behind. The problem is, at least for this year, they have to get the sign-off from the ACC, the Big 12, and all the other conferences for anything to happen in the CFP. The issue with that is, after the 2025 season, that's no longer the case. In the 2026 season and really going forward, the SEC and the Big Ten essentially have all of the negotiating power. They essentially get to decide which way this thing goes going forward, how this is going to work out, and let's be totally honest, the TV companies, all of those people will follow suit because that's where all the money comes from. I think we all understand that at this point, so it is not something that I don't think anything is going to happen to the CFP going into 2025. I think we will have a very similar format. I think the top four conference champions will get those automatic buys. I don't love that. I'll be totally honest. That's not the way that I would go about this. But frankly, I probably wouldn't expand it to 12 teams. So what do I know about this whole process? But at the end of the day, I do think it's a very interesting topic. I don't think 2025 is going to hold a lot of craziness. I do think beyond that is going to be a really interesting topic of conversation. And that's exactly what the SEC and the Big Ten met about last week, I believe on the 19th. They got together and started discussing the future of this sport, and they got a little bit deeper than 2026. They got all the way to 2032 or 2031, in some cases. But at the end of the day, let's talk about the stuff that's going to happen here relatively soon, and then we can get into the nightmare scenario that could be on the horizon here in a minute. But at the end of the day, for 2026, one of the big time things that has kind of gained traction is expanding the playoff. I imagine that. Obviously, people want to expand the playoff. Obviously, ESPN is very much pushing to have more of these games, to add to their inventory, to add to their paybook at the end of the day. So definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch. 14 teams seems to be kind of the way that this thing is going to bear out. And as we just talked about, it's probably going to change in 2026, which means these two guys have a ton of power. Greg Sankey, the commissioner of the SEC, Tony Petitti, the commissioner of the Big Ten. Both these guys are going to be huge to watch, and they're going to be two guys that have essentially all of the power. When you walk into that room next year, when all those people walk into that room, they're going to understand that at a certain point, they're going to have to bend the knee to these guys just a little bit. Now, you obviously don't want to cut out anyone. I very much want everyone to be involved, would love the group of five to be involved, but I'm kind of in favor of group of five playoff, and that's something I can get into in a little bit deeper detail later on. But at the end of the day, it's looking like we're looking at a 14-team playoff after the 2025 season, going into 2026, and really going forward. Could expand to 16, could expand to 25 at this point, 24 at this point, because that's just the reality of where we are right now. But the SEC and the Big Ten will have a lot to decide on how they want to go about this, and at least early reports of what they want is 4 auto bids. They want 4 auto bids each. They want the SEC to get 4 teams no matter what. They want the Big Ten to get 4 teams no matter what. And then down the ladder it goes. It goes for the Big 12 and the ACC. You get 2 each. So 2 Big 12 teams, 2 ACC teams. It's kind of interesting how that's going to work out with the conference titles, and we'll break that down here in a second. But then you're left with only 2 other spots. You're left with the Group of 5 champion, the highest rated, so was Boise State this year, could very well be UNLV or someone else another year, but at the end of the day, going to be an interesting thing to watch there. And then 1 at large, and let's just be totally honest, 9 times out of 10, that at large is going to be Notre Dame. That is a very, very good program right now. Marcus Freeman has them moving in the right direction, so I'd be a little bit surprised if it wasn't Notre Dame the majority of the years that this unfolded, and there's a lot of different things to kind of unpack here. Frankly, in my absolutely ideal world, it would be all auto bids. You would not have, or not all auto bids, all at-large bids, excuse me. It would not be any auto bids. People would be able to decide in that room. The problem is, if that was going to happen, I'd want a very different committee in that room than what we have right now. So that's probably not going to unfold. But with this, as you can see, there's not much of a committee to begin with. There's auto bids, and there's ways to figure out these auto bids without the committee being involved at all. And if we're going to have this same committee, then I'm not too opposed to that. I'll be totally honest with you. Now, wasn't opposed to anything the committee did this past year. Want to make that very clear. The right 12 teams got in. I did not think Alabama or Ole Miss or any of those teams should have been in over in Indiana or in SMU. But I also don't necessarily trust them to make the right decision in 2 years and in 3 years. So this isn't the worst idea in the world to me. Keeping it kind of out of their hands as much as possible and letting it be decided on the football field is not a bad idea to me. Now, it does lead to kind of some interesting things, and it definitely does lead to some interesting changes to how these conferences will operate going forward, especially when it comes to conference championship time. And that's kind of the big question. How do you get to 4 auto bids? Is it just the top 4 teams? Is it the 2 teams that go to the championship and just the next 2? How do you break that down? And one of the ideas that has come out is for the SEC, you got to get 4 teams, right? You have to find a way to get 4 teams. The top 2 teams will get bids. That's no question. Now, the question is, will they play on that championship Saturday? I think that's still very much up for debate. Will they have to play, or will it just be the number 1 team gets the better spot, the number 2 team gets the slightly worse spot, and they move forward from there? But those 2 teams will get bids regardless if they play that weekend or not. The new thing will be in both the SEC and the Big Ten, there would be a 3 versus 6 matchup and a 4 versus 5 matchup for those other 2 bids. So let's say 3 beats 6 and 4 beats 5. Those teams would get in. If 5 beat 4, they would get in over 4, and it would be kind of a rotating door of different teams that would have got in. So I believe one of the matchups this year would have been Alabama against LSU, or maybe Tennessee against Ole Miss. Those would have been very interesting matchups, and it would have been really fascinating to see how those would have kind of played out and how those teams would have ended up getting in or not getting in. And the reality of this is, when you have the SEC and the Big Ten, and if you did have it as all at large bids, it was no auto bids, and you were just picking the 12 or 14 or 16 best teams in the country, you'd find you get a lot of SEC and Big Ten teams. We did it this past season. You would get that pretty much every single season if it was auto bids. Or if it was at large bids, excuse me. But auto bids doesn't necessarily change that much to me. It doesn't necessarily hurt too much that the SEC and Big Ten are getting more auto bids than the Big 12 and ACC. I don't think any of them should get any auto bids, frankly, but I don't necessarily see it as a big issue because, let's just be totally honest, the SEC and the Big Ten are playing a little bit different level of football than what they're playing in the Big 12 and the ACC. This would likely be the case regardless of if there are auto bids or at-large bids, so I don't think it really changes the structure in terms of how many conferences get how many teams and that type of thing. Now, it does change conference championship weekend in a way that I don't necessarily love it. I'll be totally honest. I very much want these conference championships to mean something, and maybe they could. Maybe it could be you automatically get a home playoff game, or you automatically get home playoff games all the way up to the semifinal, or whatever that looks like. But I'd love to keep the energy in that SEC championship game, in that Big Ten championship game, and then in the Big 12 and the ACC, they're thinking about just not playing a championship game altogether. Because you remember back to last year, SMU was very worried. Going into that game, they did not think they were comfortably in, and if they were to lose that game by 14, 17 points, like it looked like they were going to there for a second, I don't think they would have gotten in. I think someone else would have jumped in above them, probably an Alabama team that has since been proven that they probably shouldn't have been in the first place. So I do think it's a very interesting conversation where SMU would have entirely avoided that conversation this year. If this was in place, they would have automatically been in, and then it would have been Clemson against Miami for that other ACC spot, and that would have been something to watch. There's no doubt about that, and probably something that I think it's up in the air, right? I think a lot of people would be in favor of this because these conferences are a logjam. The ACC has 17 teams. The Big 12 and the SEC have 16. The Big 10 has 18 teams. It's a lot of teams, and it's really hard for these teams to differentiate from each other. So those top 2 teams that go to Indianapolis or that go to Atlanta at the end of the year, are they all that different than the 3rd and 4th and 5th teams? And I think a lot of people would argue that Ole Miss team, not all that different than that Texas team that found their way to the semifinal this past year. So there's a lot of really back and forth arguments that could happen here. I fully understand that maybe that 3 and 6, or maybe that 6 team that is just a half game behind the number 2 team in the conference deserves a little bit more of a chance to possibly get involved, to possibly get into the field than they did this past year. But at the same time, I very much want these conference championships to mean something. I very much want them to be an important part of this game going forward. It feels like they're not going to be. So that's going to be something to watch, and definitely something that we will get into in time, and we'll see how this develops over this year, because as I said before, a lot of this is not going to happen until 2026. So we have a little bit of time to get used to it, a little bit of time to come to terms with it, because there's going to be a lot of changing, especially to the kind of the schedule of the college football season, the way conference championship week works, the way a lot of this stuff works is going to change very quickly, but at least we have a little bit of time to get used to it. I think 2025 will look the exact same as this past year did, at least in terms of format. Maybe the seeding could be changed, but I'd be a little bit surprised there. After that, it's pretty much in the SEC and Big Ten's hands, and then you just got to pray that they make the right decision. I think there's a couple on the table that are okay. I don't necessarily think all of them are the way that I would go about it. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. And I think the future of the CFP, it's firmly in the hands of two people, Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey, and they can decide to do what they want to do with it. And frankly, it's probably not going to be something that a lot of people like, but it's going to be really interesting to watch this. Over the next 12 to 18 months, a lot's going to change, a lot of decisions are going to be made, and we're just going to have to see where all this lands. But you just got to hope that at some point the cooler heads prevail and we get everyone involved in a fair and equitable way, and we have a really fun playoff like we did this past year. A little too many teams in my opinion, but at the end of the day, I'm not opposed to more football. So we'll talk about that obviously in more detail throughout the offseason as more details come out around what the SEC and the Big Ten are thinking. But let's take our first break. Let's take a little break here, just a short one, and then let's get back to spring game cancellations. A lot of teams, including Texas, Nebraska, USC, deciding to not have a spring game this upcoming spring, and it's kind of making some people mad. So let's talk about it, why it's happening, why it's probably a good idea overall, and why there's definitely some downsides to it as well. But we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the changes that are going to go on with the CFP here pretty soon, and a lot of those are going to have to do with what the SEC and the Big Ten want the CFP to be in a couple of years, and it's probably not going to be something that a lot of Big 12 and ACC fans love, but we'll see how it goes. We'll definitely keep our pulse on that, and we'll keep you guys updated as it unfolds. But another thing that's been happening around the college football world is spring game cancellations. A lot of teams are opting for kind of a different way to go about spring going forward, with this sport kind of mirroring the NFL more and more as we get down the road. Some teams are mirroring the NFL a little bit more and more as we get down. So it's going to be really interesting to watch all of this unfold, and I think there's a couple of different reasons that this is happening. There's a couple of different reasons that people have given, some that I don't fully buy, some that I totally buy, and I think some that they haven't said but are definitely a good reason for this thing to be canceled. So let's go ahead and jump into this, and we'll start with the teams that have canceled their events this far. Texas, Nebraska, USC, Missouri, and Florida State. None of those teams will have the spring game. None of those teams, as of right now, will have kind of a pseudo spring game like Ole Miss had last year, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But these teams will not have a spring game, and it'll be kind of an interesting thing. It's definitely something where Texas, they cited kind of wear and tear after playing 16 games this year, 14 games the year before. I'm not fully buying that. I'll be totally honest with you. If you remember anything about this past Texas offseason, the two people that got injured, CJ Baxter and Christian Clark, both got injured in fall camp. So practices are a little bit more aggressive than those spring games are. Even Kirby Smart, I saw Graham Coffey on Twitter, who covers UGA football. He was talking about Kirby Smart saying every time after that spring game, he just said, that was the easiest practice we've had all spring. So it's not that these spring games are more intense. It's not that the guys get injured at a higher rate than they do in practice. That one's not really the reason. Let's just be totally honest. Now, there are good reasons to do this, but I don't necessarily think wear and tear is a great reason to get rid of your spring game. But that was the one that Steve Sarkisian gave, at least for the time being. I think there's a couple other reasons that they would do that, and we'll get to that here in a second. For Nebraska, it was a little bit more of the tampering side of things. I know that's a big time worry around the sport right about now, and I do agree that that is definitely something that you have to think about. When you go out on a spring game, you're essentially giving all your guys an audition for other teams, and that is a question that you're going to have to answer, and that's something that not everyone loves by any means. So it's going to be an interesting thing. I don't necessarily think if a team wanted your guy, I don't think a spring game is going to change it one way or the other. I think they're going to come get your guy or they're not, one way or the other, before or after the spring game. So I don't think that necessarily changes too much in the tampering world, but that is a very real worry. You give your guys one last chance to audition for every other team in the country, and then they get calls very shortly after. I can promise you that. And then you got USC, Missouri, Florida State, all have kind of given different options. USC was a little bit of both between the wear and tear and tampering. Missouri and Florida State kind of the same thing, and all of those reasons, I understand where they're coming from. I do think there is some validity to some of those worries, but at the end of the day, I think there's better reasons why they're not doing it, and we'll talk about those in a second, but a couple of teams that are doing what they call untraditional spring games. Ole Miss did this last year with the Grove Bowl games, and this was kind of a divisive topic, weirdly enough, on X and on Twitter and on all those different social apps. People loved it or they hated it. I frankly loved it. I thought the biggest thing about spring games in general, is getting the fans involved, is allowing the fans to come see your team for free, get a chance to go see your players and get some autographs, see them have some fun, and that's exactly what happened down in Oxford this last year. Now, it's not necessarily football, and if you came to see football, you didn't necessarily get what you wanted, but you got a dunk contest, which was pretty cool. But at the end of the day, I do think that's a fun way to engage fans, at the very least. That's a fun way to get the fans involved, get them in the building, have a good day for the fans, and then continue moving on about your business. Because at the end of the day, spring games are way more for the fans than they are for the teams, because, as I said earlier, they're relatively easy practices in the grand scheme of things. Also, Ohio State, Iowa, Arizona, those will all do kind of untraditional. Not really sure what form those will take. I don't think they'll be kind of a Grove Bowl games type thing, but I do think they'll be probably just a little bit more pseudo scrimmages, just a little bit different, a little bit more safe, a little bit more just keeping your foot off the gas pedal that little bit more than you need to during this time. So it's all kind of up in the air. I think there's a lot of people that will not love these untraditional spring games, but the reality is I think a lot more of them are coming down the pipe. I think the teams that we just talked about could very well join this list. A Texas team that definitely has the ability to have something like this, they very well could have an untraditional spring game in a couple of weeks and just not call it a spring game, but call it a day at DKR, whatever it's called. At the end of the day, I do think a lot of the teams that we talked about not having games will probably join this list, at least in some capacity, and that's kind of the biggest thing for me. You want to make sure that the fans are involved. You want to make sure the fans that have that day during the spring where they get to go out and support their team, you don't want to take that away entirely, and these four teams at the very least are trying something a little bit different. And then there are a ton of teams that are still having games. There are a ton of teams that are still going to suit up and have a relatively normal spring game. Alabama, Notre Dame, Florida, LSU, Michigan, Oklahoma, Oregon, Tennessee, all those teams will play, and all of them will play on April 12th. So it'll be a really fun time. We will still be able to see those incredible games. We'll still be able to see a guy like Ty Simpson. Is he going to be the starter for Alabama? For Notre Dame, will C.J. Carr step up into the mix? For Michigan, watching Bryce Underwood get to work is going to be an incredible thing to watch and might be one of the biggest names to watch as we get into spring. So there will be plenty of fun during spring. There will be plenty of spring games to watch during this time. Some teams are opting away from that, and there's a number of different reasons for that. I think one of the bigger reasons, and one that not everyone's saying, but one of my favorite college football guys in the business right now is saying, money saving is a big part of this. Let's just be totally honest. And this is something that Brooks Austin came up with, and over at the Film Guy Network does an incredible job covering mainly Georgia football, but does a number of different teams, a number of different film studies, does a great job. But he was talking about this. A lot of bills are coming up for a lot of these teams. You know, they have the $20 million that's going to revenue sharing this upcoming year and going forward. They have a number of different things in NIL. A couple of these teams are updating facilities. Every single team, every single athletic department in the country is trying to save money. They're trying to find a way to make sure that all the ends meet, make sure that they have all of the money they could possibly need going into this new era, because you don't want to get caught without the money that you owed a player, that you promised a player, because as we've seen in the past, that leads to some lawsuits, and you don't need that on your table by any means. So money saving is a big time part of this. It costs money to put these things on. You are doing a full day of game operations for essentially no money because you're not going to charge your fans to come into that thing. Now, some teams do, or some teams did, and kind of went away from that in the past couple of years, but you still got to put on concessions. You still got to put on all these different things that do cost quite a bit of money. So it is a money saving tactic. And it's one of those things that I'd still love them to have something, but maybe they can save a little bit of money in that process and just make sure that they have that 20 million, that they have all the NIL money, that they have everything that they possibly could need going into 2025, 26, and going forward. So I do think money saving is a part of this. I do think it's just a day where they say, maybe that's one that we can knock off the checkbooks and say that's going to go towards NIL. And I don't think many fans would be too opposed to that. I think a lot of fans understand that if you're going to win this game at the end of the day, if you're going to win a national title, you got to have NIL involved. So saving a little bit of money on a spring game, if it means that you win one or two more games in the fall, I think fans will be more than fine with that. The other part of this is it's an NFL approach. You know, you're getting a little bit closer to what the NFL is in payment, in structure, and maybe even player values, maybe even a player union coming up here pretty soon, which I think is absolutely necessary. And another thing that we can get into a little bit later, but it's an NFL approach. You know, you're playing a 16-game schedule. You want to make sure that you have your eyes fully ready to go into the next season, and the NFL seems to have that down pretty good. So OTAs, different things like that are absolutely something that could happen in the next couple of years for college football, and I don't think it's a really terrible thing. Now, I don't necessarily love it, but as long as you have those open practices where people can come in and get to view like NFL teams have, I don't see the real harm in this. I don't think it really hurts you to not have a spring game, but have an OTA day where everyone can come out and kind of enjoy it and do some autographs and do some different things. So overall, I think it's just some teams looking around saying, if this thing is going to be like the NFL, I might as well mirror the guys in the NFL. I might as well mirror the teams that have been doing it this way for a very long time and have done a really good job doing it this way. So I do think that's part of it. They're just looking at the next level and saying, we're becoming more like that. We might as well lean into it. And then finally, poaching is a real part of this. There's no doubt about that. There are a number of different teams that are watching spring games all around the country. There are a number of coaches that will be watching spring games. There are some coaches that job it is to watch spring games to see if there are guys that they want. That's just the reality of the sport right now. Something we absolutely have to get under control. There's no doubt about that. And definitely something that will be kind of litigated over the next little bit, but it is a reality. It is an audition for another team in some ways. It is an audition to go to another team to get a little bit more money, or maybe to, get your brand out there just a little bit more. It's all business. I fully understand that, and this is a part of spring games. It's a part that I don't think any coach likes. So Matt Rule said as much. He does not want his guys getting poached by other teams because they put on a 4-touchdown performance in their spring game, and I understand that. Now, I don't necessarily think it's a huge worry. I do think some teams are, if they want your guy, they're going to come get your guy regardless of the spring game performance. But at the end of the day, I do think it is something to think about and is a deterrent to having that spring game coming up in a couple of weeks. But overall, I think my take is, it's not the ideal way I want things to go by any means. I very much want spring games to be a thing. Frankly, I would love for Texas to play UTSA in the spring. I'd love for Nebraska to play a small team in Nebraska. I'd love it to be kind of a really fun way to get some FCS team involved, maybe give that little payment when you don't have to play them in the regular season. You get to play them during the spring and give them that $2 million that helps out that athletic department. But again, money saving is a huge part of the sport right now, especially right now. Now, a couple years down the road, maybe Texas, Nebraska, USC, they have everything fully under control, and they can say, let's bring back the spring game. Let's get back to this kind of the roots that we have. They could also say, let's just do a great fan event this upcoming year. Maybe we do everyone comes out and gets autographs for a day. Maybe kids come out and do drills with the players, whatever it looks like. The biggest thing here is the spring is a very long time for college football fans to not have college football. Spring games are really fun, and a lot of them, don't mean all that much. Obviously, you don't necessarily get a good idea of how great the team is because it's a zero-sum game, and that's something we'll talk about a lot throughout this spring process. But overall, it's an unfortunate casualty of the new age of college football. It's something that I'd very much like to continue on, and it will continue on for a couple of years at a number of different places. Will it continue in 10 years? I'd be a little bit surprised if I'm being totally honest. And I almost hate to say that, but I do think there's a reality where the schedule for college football, even in the offseason, mirrors a lot of the schedule of the NFL. And I think there's pros and cons to that. I think there's still ways to get the fans involved. And as long as that's happening, as long as we have the fans involved on a consistent basis throughout the offseason and giving them that chance to go in for free and get a couple autographs, enjoy that, go to see Arch Manning play during a practice. Go see, Jaden Maiyava. Go see Dylan Raiola throw at a practice. I think as long as you have that, you're more than fine. It's far, far down on my worry list for college football is spring games getting canceled, but is kind of a new wrinkle to this sport, a new wrinkle to the offseason, and we'll see how it unfolds over the next little bit. Maybe some teams will go back to it in 2025 and going forward. Maybe some teams will continue to kind of lean away from it over the next couple of years. But will be a really interesting thing to watch. We'll see how it unfolds for Texas, for Nebraska, for USC. We'll see if they add anything to the schedule. A lot of different things that we'll be watching over the next little bit, but plenty of spring games to talk about, and we will have plenty of time to get into that. But let's take our other break here, and when we come back, let's talk about the Combine. It is starting today up there in Indianapolis. Measurements, on-field workouts are getting going, and let's go through the schedule. Let's get into some teams, some players to watch, a lot of different things. As we get into the Combine, we'll talk about it right after this. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all the different spring game cancellations. Texas, USC, Nebraska have all decided they are no longer going to do a spring game. I don't love it, I'll be totally honest with you, but at the end of the day, I understand where they're coming from. A lot of money saving that has to happen, a lot of different things that go into that decision, and I think a little bit of NFL that goes into that decision, and I think we'll see a lot of more teams make that decision over the next couple of years. But let's get into the Combine. That is what's going on this week up there in Indianapolis. There's been a little bit of drama around a couple of different reporters up there, but we'll leave that to the side for the time being. Let's just go through this. Let's go through all the big time storylines. We'll start with the schedule, we'll get to the teams that you're going to see the most from a college perspective, and then we'll get into some players that are not participating, some big time players to watch, and definitely one guy that I think can gain just about as much as anyone throughout this next little bit. Excuse me, I'm a little bit ahead of myself there, but let's get to the schedule first. That's the thing we want to check off here, and it starts today, at least in earnest. It starts today. Now, the place kickers, defensive linemen, and linebackers will do their measurements, they'll do on-field workouts, and there's a couple of guys in those groups that are just huge to watch. There's a couple of guys, that D-line class is as deep as you can possibly imagine, going to be incredible to watch them go through on-field workouts, and then you also have DBs and tight ends doing team interviews. So a guy like Tyler Warren, who we'll talk about here in a second, who is not going to work out during this week, this will be a huge day for him. It'll be interesting to see how he comes out of it. Frankly, I don't think a lot's going to change. I think that's your tight end one all the way up to draft day, but obviously will be a huge day for him because he won't have too much else going on this week other than those team interviews. Then you move on to Friday, and the place kickers, defensive linemen, linebackers, they move on to bench press. DBs, tight ends, they move on to the field, do the measurements, do the on-field workouts, and that'll be a fascinating thing to watch, especially for that deep tight end class that doesn't have Tyler Warren now working out or Colston Loveland. A lot of ability for a guy like Gunnar Helm or a guy like Elijah Arroyo to really jump up into those rankings. And then you have running backs, quarterbacks, and wide receivers going through team interviews. So Shadur Sanders, Cam Ward, that will be the talk of the day on Friday. A lot of different news coming out around those two guys, and it sounds like those two guys have two teams that are really circling them right now in that 2 and 3 slot, but a lot of things that will unfold over the next little bit, and we will obviously get into that as the draft gets a little bit closer. Go over to Saturday. The place kickers, defensive linemen, linebackers, they have left by this time. DBs and tight ends move on to bench press. Running back, quarterback, wide receivers, their measurements, their on-field workouts are on Saturday. And then O-linemen get into the team interviews. And that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Guys like Kelvin Banks, Will Campbell, all of those guys up at the top will be fascinating to see how they Armand Membu is going to be really interesting to watch as well. But it's going to be fascinating to see how all of that unfolds. And then you get into Sunday, and running backs, quarterbacks, wide receivers, they move on to bench press. Then they head out of Indy, and O-linemen finally get into their on-field workouts. They have to wait quite a bit to get into their business. But at the end of the day, all this is in full swing. A couple of people have already done team interviews. There's already been a little bit of talk. Feels like those top 4 picks, at least as of right now, feel pretty solid. Now, there's a lot of different time to go between now and the draft, and even now until the end of the weekend. But at the end of the day, it feels like we're getting pretty close to having a relatively good idea of who's going number 1 overall. And frankly, in my opinion, it's the best player in the class. But we'll get into that in time. If you want to go look at a couple of my rankings for the quarterbacks, for the defensive and offensive prospects, head on over to the blog. I have all of that there. So more than welcome to go look over there and tell me how dumb I am for having different rankings. But at the end of the day, let's get into the teams you're going to see from a college perspective. And it starts with the national title winners. Ohio State, obviously, is setting the pace for this combine. They could have had 2 more guys. If Sonny Styles and Davison Igbinosun did not decide to go back to Ohio State, they'd very much be in Indianapolis this week, and that number would be 17. But they're up at 15 right now. Going to be awesome to watch Will Howard go through workouts. He's my QB4 right now. Definitely could jump up in that list, definitely could jump down in that list with a couple of different guys coming in with huge weeks. And then you get into Texas and Georgia at 14 each. Remarkable. And I think between them, they probably have 4 of the top 15 picks. When you talk about Mykel Williams and Jalen Walker over on the Georgia side, and then for Texas, Kelvin Banks, Jahdae Barron, both guys that could very well go in the top 15 picks. Jahdae Barron becoming a very, very popular guy around the draft process. And I can promise you, when he gets in those team interviews, teams are going to fall in love with this kid. I can absolutely promise you that. He works so hard and is a remarkably versatile player. But then you get into Oregon, a really good team. Will be awesome to see what Dylan Gabriel can do. Ole Miss, Jackson Dart will be great to see what he can do. Walter Nolan is the guy that I'm watching very closely today and tomorrow. See how he does with the D lineman. And South Carolina, got to watch Kyle Kennard. He's going to be fascinating. A lot of different people have a lot of different opinions about where he's going to go. Is it going to be late first round? Is it going to be early second round? Is it going to be late second round? A lot of different movement in that edge rushing class, and he's going to try to fly up those boards. And then you got Miami. Cam Ward's leading the way, obviously. Xavier Restrepo, I'm so excited to see. And then Elijah Arroyo, one of my favorite players in this entire draft class. I think he's going to be a downright star at the next level. Cannot wait to see him go through workouts here pretty soon in the next couple of days. But those are the teams that you're going to see the most often. Those are the teams you're going to see represented. Obviously, will not have the logo on their chest anymore, but at the very least, Ohio State fans, you get to watch 15-year guys go through that combine process and hopefully come out with some pretty good grades from it. But another thing to watch is the people that just aren't participating, the people that aren't doing the workouts. We've already talked about a couple, but Shedeur Sanders will not throw at the combine. He will throw at his pro day, and I think that'll do the trick. I don't necessarily think he has to throw. The interviews will yield a lot here. That's definitely something that I think a lot of teams are looking at first. They would love to get him in that room. I realize I spelled his name wrong now. Apologies, Shedeur Sanders. It is EU, not UE. Apologies. But at the end of the day, the interviews are going to be very interesting. Over the next couple of days, we'll get a lot of intel about what different teams thought about him, what the Browns thought, what the Giants thought, what the Titans thought, which maybe could still be the number 1 overall pick, but he will not be throwing this week. Would love to see him throw, but at the end of the day, that pro day with LeJonte Wester and Travis Hunter and all of his guys, I think that will be more than fruitful for him, so that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Also, Cam Ward, another guy that is still very much up in the air. Don't know if he's going to throw. If I were him, I would throw, especially with Shedeur not throwing. I would try to steal the show, and I would throw this week, but definitely something to watch. He could decide not to, and then the door opens for a guy that I'm going to talk about here in a second, but Abdul Carter is not going to participate in the workouts. He will be doing interviews as well. He suffered an injury towards the end of Penn State season, so still kind of nursing that. Frankly, if you want to drop him to that 15 spot so my Falcons can pick him up, I would not mind that at all, but let's be honest, he is not falling to the 15 spot. I frankly believe he's going to be the number 1 guy off the board. There's not a thing in the world that can change anything about this guy. He is my top prospect in the entire draft. He's an absolute freak of nature. He could sit on his couch for the next 2 months. I'm still drafting him number 1 overall. Freak of nature and definitely a guy that I want on my football team. His teammate, Tyler Warren, like we talked about earlier, will not participate in workouts either. Neither will Colston Loveland. So those top 2 tight ends that likely will go in that first round are not going. There's a lot of tight ends that really like that idea. There are a lot of tight ends that really want to make a name for themselves this week, and without Tyler Warren on the field, that'll be just a little bit easier. So that'll definitely be an interesting thing to watch. A very good football player. He'll go through interviews in the next couple of days, and he's going to be tight end 1. Let's just be totally honest. I don't think that changes this weekend, but a lot of guys are very happy that they don't have to share the field with Tyler Warren on in the next couple of days. And then Ashton Jeanty, kind of the same exact thing with Tyler Warren. He did not need to work out. He is going to be the running back 1. There are a lot of incredible running backs, and I'll come out with my rankings because the top 10 is just impossible to figure out with his running back class. It's so darn good. But at the end of the day, Ashton Jeanty will be your running back 1. He didn't need to work out this weekend. The interviews will do plenty for him, and he's going to be an incredible back at the next level, but we won't quite get to see him go through workouts this upcoming week. But what are the players that are going to work out and have huge weeks ahead of them? I think Quinn Ewers starts the day. I think he is the biggest guy you're going to be watching this upcoming weekend because it sounds like this past year he was dealing with an oblique tear, not just an oblique strain that was reported throughout the year that it was an oblique strain. That's what he was dealing with. Sounds like it was a real tear of his oblique, and he was just kind of battling through it. Now, I don't know how much that changes going forward. I don't know if that changes his draft stock a ton or just a little bit, but he is fully healthy going into this week. He does get a chance to really show what he can do as a fully healthy quarterback, and you haven't really seen that since that Michigan game where he had a really good game. He was a very, very good player and definitely could jump up into that quarterback 3 position. I have Jackson Dart there right this second, but absolutely could be Quinn Ewers by the end of this week. I think he'll do a great job in the interviews, and then it's going to be a huge workout for him. He's got to prove that that injury did hold him back just a little bit throughout this year, and he's got to be able to put on a show if he wants to jump up in that board, because right now I would put him probably in that late second round. I think he could very well jump into the late first round if he has a really good week and really surprises some people and shows that that injury did have a ton to do with how effective he was this past season. Mike Green is another guy you're going to want to watch out for. The edge rusher from Marshall has really started to turn heads, and if you watched him at all in the 2024 season, you fully understand why. A terrifying person, a guy that can absolutely tear people to pieces. He did that in the Senior Bowl. In the Senior Bowl, he was the talk of the town. He was the guy that was dominating everyone down there in Mobile, and I think he could lock up a first-round position in the next couple of days. He might already have locked up a first-round position, but maybe even could be a top 15 pick. Wouldn't mind this guy going to my Atlanta Falcons either. So very, very talented kid, and I think over the next couple of days, a lot of people are just going to try to confirm what they've seen on tape. They want to make sure that the measurables all go out. They want to make sure that the on-field workouts match what they're seeing on tape, and if it all does, then I have no doubts that this guy will be a top 15 pick, and he'll be a very effective edge rusher at the next level. And then Tedariah McMillan is a very interesting guy that we're going to be watching throughout this week because he started as a number 6 overall pick to the Raiders and a number 5 overall pick to the Jaguars, and being among the class of a Travis Hunter or a Shadur Sanders. Now he's kind of dropped down. I've seen him at 19. I've seen him at 20 for the Chargers. I've seen a couple of different picks for him. He could fly right back up into the top 10 this week. He is such a physically imposing person. He is such a remarkable player when it comes to 50-50 balls. Really reminds me of Drake London among a lot of other players at the NFL level, but he's definitely a guy that if he puts together good workouts, if he puts together really good interviews, he could jump right back up into the top 10. I think right now he's sitting somewhere in the teens and could very well stay there and would be more than fine with that, because if you go to the Buccaneers, you're going to be more than fine. If you go to the Chargers, you'll be more than fine, and those are the two teams that I've seen kind of around him the most. But I do think he's a guy that this week is going to be huge. You know, he wants to prove that you were actually right the first time. You know, when I was getting picked number 6 overall, that's a little bit closer to where I should be instead of number 19, number 20, and this week will be huge for him to kind of prove that to everyone, and it'll be awesome to watch. There's no doubt about that. But overall, the Combine's always awesome. It's always an interesting time to see some of our players kind of go off to the next level. You know, if you're an Ohio State fan, you get to see your guy Jack Sawyer. You get to see your guy Will Howard go off to that next level and really start that process. And you get to see him kind of represent your team for the very last time. Now, I will remind everyone that the tape is going to do the talking. So someone could have a great week this week and not find their way into the first round. Someone could have a terrible week and still be a top 12 pick. It's just at the end of the day, people take this with a grain of salt. Make sure that you understand that this is far from the end-all be-all, but will be a very fun week. Will give us a lot to look forward to at the next level and a lot of really special players. When you look at that running back class, that tight end class, that defensive line class, love them all. Cannot wait to see all of them unfold, and it's going to be a special, special time in this next couple of days and a lot of movement if I had to imagine. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC, of Just Another College Football Podcast. Still kind of getting right here, but we'll call it episode 1 of season 2 of Just Another College Football Podcast. New and improved now on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, all the socials, as you've seen earlier in the show. More than welcome to follow me over there, interact with me as much as you want, ask any questions you have, come after me for my bad rankings, whatever you have. I'm more than happy to interact with you guys. Would love to be able to interact with everyone on here. So thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and like wherever you are on Spotify, Apple, YouTube. Like and subscribe. Do it over on all of them, and tell some of your friends to come on over and subscribe and like as well. But thank you once again for watching, and I will see you guys next week.